Hello, and welcome to our discussion of the power of patronage in early Renaissance Italy. So right off the bat, what does Renaissance mean? I'm sure you all know. It means rebirth, and in this case it's the rebirth of classical antiquity, the art, culture, and values of ancient Greece and Rome. We're going to be looking today at the 15th century, so the 1400s. In the first half of the century, much of the innovation that we consider the early Renaissance happened in Florence, and you already know why. Florence was an important commercial center, an important banking center, and so you have wealthy patrons who can pay for works of art. In the second half of the 15th century, the ideas of the Renaissance begin spreading outward from Florence. Artists travel, they bring these ideas with them, and patrons from around the rest of Italy want what's latest and greatest that's coming out of Florence. The theme of today's lecture is patronage. It's important to understand that the art of the Renaissance wasn't just a painting that the artist wanted to do to express himself, to convey some sort of inner emotion. Instead, all works of art and architecture were commissioned. Usually you had a patron. Now, a patron could be a private individual, a religious organization, or a civic group, such as the guilds, and we'll talk about them in a moment. The idea that an artist is going to paint or sculpt whatever they want and then sell it to a buyer doesn't really exist in this period. The only time you might see this happening is in the production of images of the Virgin Mary and Christ child. Every household needed to have one of these paintings, and so artists could produce these knowing that they would have a buyer. So let's talk about the different types of patrons. Private patrons took on a variety of forms. Wealthy families regularly endowed chapels, which were the expression of their piety and devotion. They usually served as burial sites, and these are places that held religious services. Wealthy families might even construct an entirely new church, or, as one of the examples that we'll see, the facade of an older church. Individuals and families also built palaces for themselves, and these palaces needed to be filled with art, both painting and sculpture, and so that's what we'll see today. The other side of the patronage coin was public or civic patronage, and this was aimed at the glorification of the city. Remember that the city-states at this time are in competition with one another, and they compete through the commissioning of art. The major guilds were key elements in Florentine politics in this period, and commissioned a lot of the art that we'll be looking at today. The imagery could be secular for such commissions, but it was often religious, as the civic and religious elements of life were intertwined. Why did individuals or groups choose to commission works of art? Well, we've already talked about this for a moment. It could function as a display of the patron's wealth, power, knowledge. It could be propagandistic. It could be philanthropic. One such Medici paid for a monastery and a new library. Or it could be commemorative. One popular thing to commission were burial chapels. Altarpieces were another. So who are these guilds I've been talking about? The guilds emerged in the 12th century, so in the 1100s, and they had a long staying power. In Florence's Republic, power rested in the hands not of an aristocracy, so not of kings and princes and dukes, but in its merchant class, and thus in their guilds, which were the dominant forces of Florentine politics. They were major patrons. They contributed to the building and decoration of numerous churches and hospitals throughout Florence. Two of the most important are the Arte della Lana, who were their wool manufacturers. They will oversee the start of Florence's cathedral, and the Arte di Calimala, the wool merchants, and they oversaw the dome that we'll talk about in a moment. The other key idea you need to understand for this lecture is humanism. Humanism is a code of civil conduct, a theory of education, and a scholarly discipline. The chief concerns were human values and interests as distinct from, not opposed to, religion's otherworldly values. There was a philosophy of reason over dogma. And it guided the conduct of life in the Republic of Florence. Humanist enthusiasm for the study of antiquity involved the conscious emulation of Roman civic virtues. You were supposed to, as the ancient Romans supposedly did, although they rarely did this, provide service to the state, participate in government, and defend the state institutions. There was also at this time a new knowledge of an interest in Greek. They had recovered lost Latin and Greek literature and philosophy. A great contribution at this period was the translation of these works. This will clearly impact the art of the Renaissance. So we're starting in Florence with a competition. This is generally seen as the marking of the start of the Renaissance as we know it. The religious center of Florence was a complex with a cathedral, a bell tower, and an earlier structure, the baptistry, which you see on the right. This was from the Romanesque period, but the Florentines at this time believed it was from ancient Rome. The decoration of this baptistry that you can see here, it's in the heart of Florence, right in front of the cathedral, was overseen by one of those major guilds, as I've already mentioned, the Wool Merchants Guild. In 1400, they made a decision to commission a new set of doors for the baptistry. And instead of just commissioning an artist, they decided to hold a competition. The contest for the doors was the first of its kind, and it was open to all skilled masters throughout Italy. We know that 7 sculptors competed. Each were given bronze and required to produce a trial relief, showing the sacrifice of Isaac within 1 year. The subject of the sacrifice of Isaac was a good one to test artists. It involves many elements, both formal and expressive, narrative and spatial. Well, what's the story? According to Genesis, Isaac was the son of the Jewish patriarch Abraham. His birth had been a miracle, as his father was 100, and his mother, Sarah, 90. This made God's command to Abraham all the more terrible. He told him to build an altar on which to sacrifice his son. Abraham took his son up to Mount Moriah, follows his orders, and bounds his beloved son to the altar. Just as he raises the knife to fulfill God's command, an angel stops him. God then directs him to sacrifice a nearby ram that was stuck in the thickets instead. This was supposedly a test of Abraham's faith, which he passed. Well, let's see how our artist dealt with it. There are 2 panels that survive. Those are by this artist, Brunelleschi, and the other, Ghiberti. They are both 2 young artists who were under the age of 25. They had to work within a quatrefoil frame, and this was in order to compete with an earlier set of doors. A quatrefoil is essentially a square on which you have 4 lobes, and it's a kind of hard shape in which to fit a narrative. We can see that Brunelleschi has wrung all of the dramatic force out of the tale. Notice how Abraham rushes forward to his son, who stands on the altar. Just at the last minute, the angel has grabbed his arm right as the knife is at his son's throat. Isaac's body is contorted as he looks up at his father. The basic composition is arranged in 2 horizontal levels. You need sound effects. Draperies are heavy with deep, massive folds. The faces are strong with broad planes, and they're crowned with a kind of thick wig-like hair. The figures are set against a blank ground. There's really no attempt at depth in this relief. The scenery instead is confined to a few props. What Brunelleschi has done is filled every little lobe with a bit of the composition. And parts of this are a little bit awkward, like the hill behind or this figure tying his shoe, but what it shows us is that Brunelleschi loved difficult problems and intricate solutions. Now, this is the beginning of the Renaissance. They're looking back to antiquity, and probably you can pick out some things that look like ancient art. Most obvious is the body of Isaac. This is actually based on a headless torso, the so-called Belvedere torso, that had been discovered. Another figure, this, down at the bottom, who's picking a thorn out of his foot, seems a little strange for the story. And what this is a kind of homage to an ancient antique sculpture of a little boy picking a thorn from his foot. Okay, so this is Brunelleschi's attempt. Let's look at his competition. This is the submission of Lorenzo Ghiberti. While there are antique elements here, take a look at that Hellenistic torso on Isaac and the scrolls on the altar. What Ghiberti is using is that international kind of Gothic style. You can see this most easily in the graceful S-curve of Abraham's body. You have flowing, light drapery. Ghiberti's figures are ideal figures, in contrast to Brunelleschi's more naturalistic figures. But he does show an interest in the male nude form. You can get a sense of Isaac's musculature, his skeletal system. This is new. Ghiberti is also following the biblical account more closely. So for instance, we see a ram behind Abraham. An angel doesn't grab, but only calls out to Abraham. The composition makes use of diagonals to separate out the various elements of the scene. So instead of dividing it in half, like Brunelleschi did, Ghiberti has used a diagonal. What this does is create separate elements. You have the main scene and then this little background scene. It's creating a greater sense of space. It's not so much of an attempt to fit things in the different corners. So this seems a little bit more elegant or graceful compared to Brunelleschi's, which is all about violent drama. The surface of this is very finished. It shows that he was trained as a goldsmith. So, who do you think won, and why? It was unanimously given to Ghiberti, although he was less well experienced and less well known. Ghiberti went on to execute 28 panels for the bronze doors, now on the north side of the Florentine baptistry. So why did they do this? It's not really about the things we were looking at, is it drama or gracefulness? Instead, it's all about money, and this makes sense when we think about patronage in this period. Ghiberti's on the right is technically superior. Only Isaac was cast separately, together with Abraham's hand and a piece of rock. Otherwise, it was a single piece of hollow bronze. Brunelleschi's is a solid plaque. It's about 5 millimeters thick, and the different sections are soldered on. Ultimately, Brunelleschi's doors would have required around 600 more Florentine pounds of bronze, which would have made it much more expensive. And if you're the person paying for art, you want it at a discount. Just remember, Brunelleschi stressed the dramatic and realistic interpretation of the scene, while Ghiberti's is more elegant and graceful. And that, combined with the cost, made it the winner. Don't feel too badly for Brunelleschi, though. It all turns out okay for him. He goes on to create the icon of the early Renaissance. You could even say the icon of Florence, and that's the dome of the Florentine Cathedral. We know that he went away to Rome for a while and studied the architecture there, and that's going to have a profound impact on what he does here. So a little bit about the history of the Florentine Cathedral. It is a late medieval building, and they had built it to be the biggest and the best, again to compete with Siena. And it looks like medieval Florentine architecture, so you have this veneer of marbles that are colored like the baptistry itself. They had designed, over time, a huge space for the chancel, so the area for the altar and the clergy, and that was going to be covered with a dome. And so they had built up to the row of these oculus windows. But they encountered a problem. They couldn't figure out how to make a dome of this size. Building a dome is difficult. Domes want to exert great outward thrust and press out this way, or just collapse in on themselves. So they couldn't figure out how to do it, and it took quite some time. Well, that competition had worked so well to decorate the doors of the baptistry, so they decided to have another competition. And so this happens in 1418. Both Brunelleschi and Ghiberti entered, surprise, surprise. They were appointed together, probably rankling Brunelleschi's feelings, but in 1420, Ghiberti seems to have left the project, and the entire thing is credited to Brunelleschi. We know the construction began in August of 1420 and ended in 1436 by an octagonal oculus at the top. The lantern, this little white bit that you see up here, was added about 10 years later. The dome is impressive. It's 140 feet in diameter and 180 feet off the ground. This is the largest dome since the Roman Pantheon, and the highest constructed to that time. Obviously, this, when it was finished, was a way to show Florence's cultural superiority over Pisa, Siena, Lucca, and any other ones that wanted to come and try them. The importance of this is that prior to 1400, architecture had remained Gothic, and although there are many medieval elements to this, this is a new beginning for Renaissance architecture. Well, how did he do it? And what kind of challenges did he face? One of the reasons why they couldn't build the dome is because they had a problem with centering. This is a big issue for construction. Traditionally, arches and domes are built on a wooden framework called centering. Horizontal wood beams are laid across an opening in a wall at the point where the arch begins to spring, and a wooden framework or scaffolding is erected on that. So it has here, and then you add the scaffolding. What this does is support the brick or stone that's being used to construct the dome until it's completed with a keystone here that supports itself. Here, though, it was impossible to build a wooden framework to support the dome. Why? There simply weren't planks of wood large enough to be able to do this. They're not building out of concrete like the ancient Romans. So, how did Brunelleschi solve the constructional problems of the dome? What he did, instead of use centering, was to create a simple internal scaffolding. This was an arrangement of beams that converged towards the apex of the dome. They supported floors that could be lifted as the work progressed, so it was a rather ingenious solution. In order to lighten the dome, it was not made as one solid stone construction. Instead, he used what is known as a double-shelled method. And you can see on the figure on the right what I'm talking about. In green, you have the outer thin shell and then a thicker inner shell. These were made out of brick, and we'll take a look at those in a second. You can actually move between these spaces, which facilitated work. This means that the dome was lighter. On the outside, all you saw were the bricks of the dome and then these white marble ribs. This gives it a rather Gothic exterior. And in some ways, Brunelleschi was limited by what was already there. This was essentially an Italian Gothic building. It had oculi, it had an octagonal shape, and so he was obliged to use that. In order to make sure that the dome was stable, he also couldn't make a hemispherical dome like the Pantheon in Rome. That would simply collapse. So instead what he has is a taller, more pointed dome. Brunelleschi was noted for his invention of machines he invented to facilitate construction. Traditionally, masons would carry the building materials on their shoulders to great heights, but Brunelleschi invented a hoisting machine, the so-called Great Hoist, that was such a success that the cathedral's works had to publish an order forbidding Florentines from riding it. It did take some time to get up to the dome at this height, so he ordered that no one could take lunch breaks and instead had to take their lunches with him. On the right of the screen, you see his ingenious brickwork. What he's done is create a kind of herringbone pattern, and so each successive level kind of locks in the last. You can also see how you can move through these spaces, and this is a tour you can take today. At the top of the dome is the marble lantern. As I said, it was completed about 10 years later. It covers the oculus, which is 50 feet in diameter, which allows light into the church. And what this acts as is a kind of stopper to keep the dome compressed. It's relatively heavy. As I mentioned, the style is primarily Gothic to fit with what had been constructed earlier. The importance of this building can't be overestimated. We have an author who we'll learn about a little bit more in just a second, named Leon Battiste Alberti. And he wrote about this dome, saying, "Who could fail to praise the architect on seeing here such a large structure, rising above the skies, ample to cover with its shadow all the Tuscan people, and constructed without the aid of centering or a great quantity of wood? Since this work seems impossible of execution in our time, if I judge rightly, it was probably unknown or unthought of among the ancients." And this is key for understanding the early Renaissance. They were in competition with the ancients. Not only were they inspired by them, they wanted to best them. So the dome of the Florentine cathedral is Brunelleschi's claim to fame. Brunelleschi is also known for his invention of linear perspective. He did this probably as he was going to Rome to study from ancient monuments, as he needed a way to survey buildings accurately. This was a way to turn a three-dimensional object into something that could be reproduced on a two-dimensional surface. I will be posting a video online, and you can see how linear perspective is accomplished. But I just wanted to tell you a little bit about how he did this experiment. So, following this new linear perspective technique, in which lines recede towards orthogonals, you know how things in the distance get smaller. This is generally the principle behind this. He had painted this on a panel. He then drilled a small hole through his painting. He marches up to the baptistry and places his back towards the cathedral, looking out towards the baptistry. Having the painting arranged against his face, he lowers it down and looks through the hole. He's able to see from this vantage point the baptistry in front of him. He then raises a mirror in front of his face, and he sees his painting. By raising and lowering the mirror, he can see that they are exactly alike. What he had done was invent linear perspective. No written record exists from Brunelleschi's experiments, but we know he passed the method down verbally to artists like Masaccio and Donatello, who used it in their works. When Brunelleschi rediscovered linear perspective in 1420, Florentine painters and sculptors became obsessed with it, especially after this man we'll look at in just a moment, Alberti, published it in a painting manual. The conventions of perspective fits with Renaissance humanism because it structures all images of reality to address a single spectator, who, unlike God, could only be in one place at a time. In other words, linear perspective eliminates the multiple viewpoints that we see in medieval art. You can remember the Cimabue painting, for example, and instead creates an illusion of space from a single fixed viewpoint. This suggests a renewed interest and a focus on the individual viewer, and we know that individualism is an important part of humanism in the Renaissance. So let's turn to this man, Leon Battista Alberti, who was a friend and admirer of Brunelleschi. He was a well-educated man and a humanist scholar. For a while he worked as a member of the papal court, but he is best known as an architect and an author. He wrote brilliant original treatises or books on both painting and architecture. He had made himself one of the leading experts on the remains of all ancient architecture in Italy and collected every passage from classical texts that dealt with ancient buildings or statues. He then compiled this and published his findings and theories in both Latin and Italian. His book on painting, which he dedicated to Brunelleschi, is the first modern manual for painters, and it's also a humanist work, referring to ancient sources and offering a theoretical argument for painting and its importance. What's also important is that he provides this early, precise description of Brunelleschi's experiment, so other painters could follow this. He is also known for writing about architecture, and this spread his fame throughout Italy. You see him in the top right of the screen in this portrait medal, and this is done in the way to look back to the ancient coins and medals of Rome. His portrait in profile appears on the front, and on the back we have a winged eye, and there's a motto that says, "What next?" meaning he is interested in accomplishing and succeeding in all fields of study. He received this commission to put a facade or a front on the building of Santa Maria Novella in Florence. This was a 13th century church that still had not received a facade. All that were there were the kind of very base level of niches in the wall that had been revetted in marble in the typical Tuscan Gothic way. The facade was commissioned by Giovanni Rucellai, who was a wealthy banker. This was his family's church, and he is commemorated in an inscription on the facade. It was an act of piety and also self-promotion, because this inscription credits him with completing the work and giving the community this beautiful front to the church. Like Brunelleschi, Alberti had to deal with pre-existing features for this building. There was already an oculus, a round window in the center, and the nave that you can see in the middle was taller than the side aisles. So how do you make a building, essentially a medieval church, look like it is from antiquity? Well, he comes up with a clever solution. On the top story, he places the facade or the front of an ancient Greek or Roman temple with 4 columns that support an entablature and a triangular pediment. On the first floor, he places an evocation of a triumphal arch. Still, however, there was this temple front problem. How was he to bridge the difference in height between the tall middle nave and the side aisles? His solution were the scrolls that you see on either side of that main upper story. And what this did was hid the sloping roofs over the side aisles. This was copied again and again by later architects in the Renaissance and the Baroque periods. Not only did he want to take the visual elements of ancient buildings, he also wanted to use a coherent system of ornamentation which depended on a mathematical system of harmonic proportions. And so what he does is divide the space in such a way that the height of the building is equal to its width. If you'll notice, the lower part of the facade, if you divide that in half, you get that red square. That is the same measurement as the entire upper story. And so what we have is this unified, proportional, harmonic design. This is important because both Christians and the ancients saw the cosmos as something that had a kind of eternal and universal perfection expressed through numerical ratios. And so what he's doing is not just using little kind of elements from ancient architecture, but placing them on a building in a way that the ancients might have found favor with. Let us turn to sculpture, and we are looking here at a niche sculpture by the great master Donatello. This is on the facade of Or San Michele in Florence. Now, Or San Michele was an odd building. It was a granary or a grain storage site, but there was also a shrine that held a miraculous image of the Virgin and Child. Because of this, different guilds in the city had paid to ornament this building, which housed the miracle-working image. However, they were really slow to do this, so in 1406, the men in charge of Or San Michele demanded that the guild decorate their niche or they would have to give up their right to it. And so starting in 1406, there's a flurry of activity. Now there's a mistake on this slide because this was completed in 1420, not 120. The guilds are in competition with each other for the best artists to promote themselves. And so there's both a civic and religious significance, as with the building itself. So here we're looking at one of these niche sculptures, and it was paid for by the Guild of Armorers and Sword Makers. Their patron saint was St. George, and this makes sense. He is famous for slaying a dragon and saving a princess. Originally, the guild had paid for and manufactured a bronze helmet and a bronze sword that St. George carried and would extend over the head of viewers. This is a marble sculpture, and because of this, it doesn't have great tensile strength. So typically in marble, you don't have an arm or leg thrust out horizontally. Nevertheless, we see a rather dramatic pose. He is standing with his feet on either side of the shield. What is surprising is his expression. If you look at it, what he seems to be is somewhat fearful or sensitive or reflective. He seems to be dreading the fight with the dragon. Now this might seem surprising. Why in this very public space would the guild want to have their patron saint look fearful? Well, this has to do with some of the current ideas going around in humanist circles. One of these men wrote that in times of safety, anyone can behave well. It is in adversity that real courage is shown. And so what we're seeing is a man marshaling his resources in proximity to danger. He is looking out, he is taking on this quest, and he is going to succeed. And this is new, this element into the narrative of psychology, this exploration of the emotions of the figures. And this is what Donatello is offering, making him the most important sculptor of the early Renaissance. Below the figure was a relief. And this was an innovation as well. Donatello came up with what we refer to as flattened relief. That means that the figures are not equally raised from the surface. Instead, in the background, it is almost as if the features have been inscribed rather than carved. What we're seeing is St. George battling the dragon. The princess, which is derived from ancient prototypes with her draperies and posture and clothes, stands on the right. But what we see Donatello is doing is using linear perspective. Notice how that arcade of columns behind the princess recedes into the distance. This is important. This is new. He's not thinking about objects and just representing these on a flat surface, but rather how the eye works. What you have is this background, and he transforms marble into air, showing distant hills and trees and clouds. and you have this sketchy kind of remarkable style. This would have been on the north side of the building, which would have had soft light, which would have brought out these features. Donatello is perhaps most well known for his bronze sculpture of the Old Testament figure David. Now there's some controversy as to when and for what place this work was commissioned. We know, however, that the patron was likely this man, Cosimo de' Medici, the head of this important Medici family, who were bankers as well as humanists, as well as important kind of de facto leaders here in Florence. He is sometimes referred to as the grandfather of the Renaissance. He commissioned Donatello to create this sculpture for the Medici palace. It likely would have gone inside this courtyard of their newly constructed palace there in the heart of Florence. And this is one of the first Renaissance palaces and first Renaissance courtyards that exist. Let's speak briefly about the physical format. This is a hollow cast bronze sculpture. This is done by using the lost wax technique. So what is this? You do not want to have a solid bronze sculpture. So what you do is create in clay your sculpture. You then, after that dries, put on a layer of wax to create an entire kind of skin. On top of that, you place a mold. You allow the mold to dry. You then heat the entire thing, as you can see on the bottom left hand of the diagram. The wax then drips out. In the space where the wax has been, you pour from the top molten bronze. When it starts dripping out the bottom of your sculpture, you know that it has made its way through the mold. After it hardens and dries, you can then break away the mold and you have your finished sculpture. Now, bronze has some advantages that marble doesn't. It has much better tensile strength, so you don't need the same kind of supports that marble does in order to project a limb, for example. Now, this sculpture was intended to be seen at a specific height on a fairly high base. David's face with his hat and down-turned head would have been more visible. The historical significance of this sculpture is that it's the first fully freestanding, large-scale nude statue produced since antiquity. And we can ask ourselves, why does Donatello choose to represent David in the nude? He does it for two reasons. In one part, he wants to recall and revive classical antiquity and ancient Greek sculptures exalted in the nude male form. And so what Donatello is doing is showing his knowledge of the classical past. But this is not all Donatello is doing. He is also using the nudity to tell the narrative. This derives from the biblical source. According to the first book of Samuel, Saul arms David in a coat of armor, helmet, and a sword, but David tells him that he's unused to armor and cannot go on that way and takes it off between the Israelites and the Philistines. They had called for single combat. No one had wanted to face the giant Goliath, but the youth David takes up the challenge with a sling and 5 rocks. Going into battle without armor, he manages to hit Goliath in the head with one of the rocks, and then he decapitates him with the sword. And so what we're seeing is a moment at the end of the story where David is triumphantly standing over the head of Goliath. The main point of the story is that the underdog wins because God is on his side. This image is symbolic more than narrative. David had been a metaphor for the city of Florence, strong against external threats. Originally, there had been on this statue an inscription identifying David as a defender of the fatherland. Why would the Medici want an image of David? Well, they're appropriating the symbols of the city. This is important because at this time, the Medici are getting more and more power. Although the idea of a nude is taken from antiquity, the style is naturalistic and appropriate to the story. He is depicted as a youth and not as a perfectly idealized classical form. You notice that his posture is naturalistic as well. Donatello is posing him in contrapposto. That means you have one weight-bearing leg and one free swinging leg. And so the figure could potentially move forward. This gives you a sense of movement and the way the body naturally stands. And on one side, you then have this uninterrupted contour and then a swelling hip on the other. Donatello is also playing with form and space. The right arm is free of the body. The left arm encloses an empty triangle of negative space, with a third void between the legs. And what this means is that every view is satisfying, and it's intended to be viewed from all sides. This, after all, was within a courtyard. And as you moved around the sculpture, you began seeing other things. For example, on the back, you can see that there is this winged made up of feathers on Goliath's helmet. And what it does is kind of rise up and tickle David gently in the inner thigh. This gives kind of learned viewers a kind of little wink and a nod as you have this beautiful young boy. Some people say this shows possibly the homoerotic interest of either the sculptor or the patron, or this group of men interested in themes from antiquity. Either way, it's important that you know that this is the first large-scale nude statue since antiquity. Let's move now to painting. Unlike the sculptors and architects of early Renaissance Florence, the painters did not have ancient works to look at. Right? No ancient paintings survived. This is before they had discovered the city of Pompeii. And so what we have is that the developments in the Renaissance take place a little bit more slowly in painting. This altarpiece by Gentile da Fabriano, showing the adoration of the Magi, is a good example of a kind of transitional figure. And what we see is, again, you have an important patron, and his desires transform the look of the work of art. Now, the patron for this was Strozzi. He was the richest man in Florence, and he commissioned Gentile to paint this work for the sacristy of the Church of Santa Trinita for his father. It seems that Ghiberti had been the architect of the chapel. Strozzi was a member of the committee that ordered Ghiberti's north door, so it was a kind of little boys' club. And what we see is that he liked the little bit more of a more international Gothic style. This altarpiece was one of the most lavish works at the time. Well, what is the subject matter? The subject is a little bit unusual for a Florentine altarpiece. The splendor of its treatment was unprecedented. The story we're seeing is the arrival of three kings from a distance to visit and pay homage to the infant Christ. And it takes place across the entire panel. In the very top left-hand part of the painting, the three men see the star that they then follow to the city of Bethlehem, arriving at the manger. And so what you're seeing is the entourage snaking through the landscape. The three kings are there in the center, and the first has fallen down on his knees to kiss the infant Christ's little teeny cute feet. This Christ then blesses the Magi. So this is the narrative, and it was probably shown because the kings allowed for this display of wealth. You have absolutely gorgeous garments. The figures of the kings are wearing brocades. They have then seemingly been embroidered with gold thread. They have gold crowns and gold halos. And the horses that are being brought along with them have gold harnesses and reins. And this is all done in actual gold leaf, which shows off the wealth of the patron. However, there are little bits of kind of psychological realism and little bits of radical naturalism, even though essentially the figures are done in a rather international Gothic style. So for example, look at the back, and you have these two midwives who are kind of consulting with one another about the gifts that they have received. They seem almost to be assessing its value. The animals in this scene are depicted with great naturalism. Look, he's showing that he can depict horses from the front and foreshortening going to the distance. Even the different gestures of the kings, as well as the Christ child, show this new naturalism at the same time that he's using elements of the international Gothic style, right? The long figures and the expensive materials. So this makes it clear that he's playing with new techniques, but also kind of still working in a vocabulary of that international Gothic tradition. It is only with the art of this painter, Masaccio, that we begin to see the kind of revolutions that we saw in sculpture in painting. Now, Masaccio is referred to by later biographers as Giotto reborn. He lived from 1401 to 1428, but he was only active for about 6 years. What's amazing is that no other painter in history contributed so much to a new style in such a short period of time. He was celebrated widely during his day. Alberti even mentions him in On Painting. Vasari, a later biographer, will mention him as well. Vasari even talked about this painting, and he said he was moved by it. Well, why is it so important? Why is Masaccio's art so important? He drew on the monumentality of Giotto with increased naturalism, but he was also the first painter to make use of the innovations of Brunelleschi and Donatello in the depiction of correct perspective. Well, a little bit about this work, about the patron and the dating. It is undocumented and undated, so we guess that it's from the year 1425, and we're pretty sure that the patrons, who you can see here and here, were members of the Lenzi family. They appear in profile, and this is a typical convention, not only for donor portraits, but as we'll see, for all portraits in Italy during the first half of the 15th century. They are shown kneeling and praying. Well, why has he created such an interesting painting, or what led him to create this? Well, in the church of Santa Maria Novella, which was a major funerary church, there were no chapels in the side walls. What he does, therefore, on the flat surface of the wall is to create the appearance of a chapel by using this new perspective technique. The subject matter is a dual subject. It is both the Holy Trinity and a crucifixion group. So you have two pictures in one, and you have Christ kind of functioning twice in these. So you have God the Father and Christ the Son, and in between, which kind of looks like God's collar, is the dove of the Holy Spirit. So you have an image of this dogma of the Trinity, that even though God is one, he has three different natures. But also you have a crucifixion group where you have Christ spread out on the cross, his body draping. You then have his mother, the Virgin Mary, pointing at him and looking at you, saying, "Look at what he has done for your sins." His close follower, John the Evangelist, looks up and is rather sorrowful. And so what you have is this kind of psychological interaction with the holy figures. You'll notice, though, that there's this divide between the space of the donors and this space, done in perspective, of the holy figures. And this is key for this period of time. The term on the slide is all'antica, and that just means in the style of the antique. So what we're seeing is that all of the little kind of architectural elements are evocative of ancient sculpture. You have ribbed pilasters with Corinthian capitals that support a classicizing cornice. And you have down below engaged, that means they're partially in the wall, Ionic columns. And this is just a different vocabulary of building. This supports an arch in the manner of the ancient Romans. And then behind we have a barrel vaulted, so an arched ceiling that looks like it has been coffered, like the ceiling inside the Pantheon in Rome from the time of the Emperor Hadrian. And what we're seeing is that they're basing architecture on Roman triumphal arches. We're seeing the triumph of Christ over death. And this is in total contrast to the International Gothic style, with its elongated forms and calligraphic patterns and abrupt shifts in scale. You have these physically grand figures. They are monumental in scale. They have a kind of sculptural clarity of contours. And this figural monumentality is related to spiritual and intellectual heroism. There's just a few colors which repeat that get you to focus on the figures rather than that kind of abundance of wealth we saw on Palestrozzi's altarpiece by Gentile da Fabriano. He's also using shadows to assert the reality of these figures. John and Christ are casting shadows in the same way that light enters this building. Well, how has he done this? How has he constructed this space? Well, he's used linear perspective, that invention of Brunelleschi, in order to make a three-dimensional world appear in two dimensions. And so in the video, you'll see how this is done a little bit more closely. But what you have are vanishing points. And all the lines converge on those spaces. So these orthogonals are all coming to this point, about eye level for the viewer. And this is what you had to do to make perspective work well. What we have then is a kind of mathematically consistent space. The goal here was to create the illusion of three-dimensionality that would convince beholders of the reality of this image, or allow them to associate the fictive world of the image with the experience of this world. Now, my favorite part of this painting is down below. This is a skeleton, if you've noticed. It is life-size, and the anatomy is more accurate than any of its predecessors in art. It seems almost to be an anatomical illustration. There is an inscription above it, done as if it were in an ancient script, and it says in Italian, "I was once what you are, and what I am, you too will be." It's reminding you of your mortality, right? Reminding of you of your humanity. And what you were supposed to do was heed this warning. The warning itself was transmuted into hope, because by the sacrifice of Christ, Christians, as they believed, could anticipate redemption. So what we have is Christ appearing in a triumphal arch, and he is being triumphant over death. The last painting we'll look at is this. It is a portrait of a husband and his wife. Now, Alberti, in his book on painting, said that portraits were intended to make the absent present. And this is an idea that we see here in this work, because although the patron, Federico da Montefeltro on the right, was still alive, his wife, Battista Sforza, had died at the age of 26, only a few months before. Federico da Montefeltro, the patron, was the ruler of Urbino. They were both well educated and considered themselves kind of humanist philosophers. Federico gained his money and position from being a mercenary. He was a condottiere, someone who would lead armies for different city-states, and he had managed to acquire wealth and a social status. On the death of his wife, he swore off military service and devoted himself to intellectual pursuits. He wanted to become this humanist ruler. He had in his court of Urbino a court artist named Piero della Francesca. He was both a painter and a theorist. He wrote the first theoretical treatise on systematic perspective. This is very unusual for a painter. His style embodies calm and rationality. This is a monumental style typical for the early Renaissance. So as I mentioned, it's a double portrait. On the back there were allegorical scenes showing their different natures. But on the front you have this husband and wife with a landscape behind them. Battista's landscape is shadow, possibly suggesting that she has died. Her actual features were probably taken from her death mask, a practice that was common at this period of time. Now he is dressed like a kind of philosopher, with this typical Renaissance hat and garb. His wife, however, is shown as almost a princess, right? You can see her spectacular pearl necklace and her elaborate hairstyle. Her hairline is so high because they actually would pluck that hair to give that specific look. She is being shown as the ideal of Renaissance female beauty. And that was often as a beautiful woman who would then be ornamented through the gifts from her husband and father. And so you're not really seeing here a psychological exploration of the sitter. Instead, you have a kind of image of their status that's being represented here as an intellectual and his beautiful bride. It is done, though, in a style that's looking back to antiquity, because what we have are profile portraits, like the portraits on ancient coins. And so this and the Latin inscription on the back all spoke to his learnedness. Now, my favorite part about this painting is a kind of little side story. You might notice that his nose is a rather strange shape. And this is because back in his younger, more reckless youth, he had a mistress who had encouraged him before a joust to put a little sprig in his helmet. And so he went into this kind of medieval joust with his visor up of his helmet. During this, a splinter from the lance went into his eye, and they had to remove it. And this was his right eye. So we're seeing his good side in this painting. In order to be able to see on that side of his face, he demanded that the doctors cut into the bridge of his nose so he could look over with his left eye. And I bring this up because although we're looking at this age of patrons using art to show off their status, this is still a violent period of time, like any time. And you have men like Federico, who, yes, they're humanists, but they're also military leaders. They are going to compete not only on the battlefield, though, but in the arts. And that's what's key to the early Renaissance in Italy. Take a look at the video about how to do perspective, and I'll see you all on Thursday.